Salam sejahtera, anda bersama saya Rizal Zulkafli dan ini Niaga AWANI. Kita mulakan dengan perkembangan luar negara. Satu letupan berlaku di pusat penapisan minyak PT Pertamina di Indonesia. Letupan berkenaan berlaku di pusat penapisan PT Pertamina Persero RUVI Balongan di Indramayu, Jawa Barat. Menurut visual yang diterima di Associated Press dan juga visual yang berkitaran di media sosial, letupan berkenaan sangat kuat dan dapat dilihat dari jarak yang sangat jauh. Sehingga kini tidak diketahui punca letupan dan jumlah mangsa. Kompas lapor susulan letupan rumah di sekitar kawasan berkenaan rosak. Insiden dilapor berlaku pada jam 12.45 pagi waktu Indonesia Barat. Dan kami akan bawakan perkembangan lanjut berkenaan dengan letupan berkenaan dalam Buletin AWANI akan datang. Seterusnya, saham di pasaran Asia Pasifik dijangka bercampur pada dagangan pagi ini. Dalam masa yang sama, syarikat Bilibili, platform penstreaman video di China, akan disenaraikan di Hong Kong. Sementara itu, Bursa Malaysia dijangka berhati-hati minggu ini dengan peserta pasaran memantau rapi pemulihan ekonomi global dan perkembangan berkaitan kapal kontena yang didaftarkan di penama Ever Given. Menurut ahli ekonomi Bank Islam Malaysia Berhad Adam Muhammad Rahim, pelabur akan menumpukan sama ada masalah di terusan Suez dapat diselesaikan pada awal minggu ini atau sebaliknya.
Beliau berkata ini kerana sekiranya gagal, keadaan itu mungkin menyebabkan rantaian bekalan terus mengalami kelewatan. Sehingga awal pagi Isnin, kapal berkenaan masih terkandas di terusan Suez yang sebelum ini saksikan trafik bernilai sekitar $9 bilion sehari. Dalam simakan akhir, harga minyak mentah Brent meningkat kepada $64 setong. Beliau berkata bagi minggu ini, FBM KLCI dijangka didagangkan dalam julat 1,600 mata hingga 1,615 mata berasaskan kecenderungan meningkat.
Seterusnya, ringgit dijangka meningkat semula berbanding dolar Amerika minggu ini dipacu sentimen pasaran lebih baik dan didorong harga minyak mentah global yang berpotensi meningkat. Menurut ahli ekonomi Bank Islam Malaysia Berhad Adam Muhammad Rahim, ringgit berpotensi catat kenaikan kepada 4.12 hingga 4.13 berbanding dolar Amerika minggu ini.
Harga minyak mentah meningkat pada Jumaat selepas mengalami penyusutan ketara sehari sebelumnya. Ia berikutan kebimbangan bahawa kapal kontena yang terkandas di terusan Suez di Mesir mungkin menghalang laluan perkapalan penting bagi tempoh seminggu. Ini sekaligus menjejaskan bekalan kepada pasaran global. Bagi dagangan minggu lepas, ringgit mencatatkan penurunan selama 5 hari berturut-turut. Ini berikutan minat risiko dipengaruhi hasil pulangan ke atas bond Amerika yang lebih tinggi, kebimbangan baru terhadap hubungan perdagangan Amerika-China, perintah sekatan pergerakan di benua Eropah dan keadaan berhati-hati terhadap pemulihan pertumbuhan global.
Seterusnya, kontrak niaga hadapan minyak sawit mentah di Bursa Malaysia Derivatives dijangka menyaksikan pemulihan teknikal minggu ini selepas mengalami kerugian minggu lepas. Menurut Palm Oil Analytics, pasaran minggu ini juga berkemungkinan disokong angka ekspor lebih baik termasuk kenaikan dalam harga minyak mentah. Sementara itu, peniaga minyak sawit David Eng mengunjurkan harga MSM didagangkan dalam jajaran kecil dan menaik minggu ini berikutan dorongan sentimen ekspor yang lebih baik. Data MSPEC Agri Malaysia pada Khamis menunjukkan ekspor produk minyak sawit Malaysia bagi 25 hari pertama Mac 2021 naik 10.4% berbanding Februari. Untuk minggu yang baru berakhir, pasaran diniagakan kebanyakannya lebih rendah. Ini menjejaki prestasi harga minyak kacang soya yang lebih lemah dan juga prospek pengeluaran yang lebih tinggi pada minggu-minggu akan datang. Dan untuk melihat kepada pengaruhi ataupun faktor yang pengaruhi pasaran pada minggu ini, kita bersama dengan Stephen Ines, Ketua Strategi Pasaran Global Aksi yang ketika ini berada di Bangkok. Stephen, hi, thank you for joining us. Stephen, the US consumer confidence for March, China's non-manufacturing and manufacturing PMI for March, and US unemployment rate for March. These are some of the key announcements expected this week. What will investors look at this week?
You know, investors are really positioning for a continuation of very, very strong data in the U.S. This is unequivocal. We're starting to see those stimulus checks actually getting into the alternative data, and this is some of the key data points that fund manager are looking at, and we saw a very much systematic bid coming back to the markets last week as volatility indexes dropped. I think investors are correct in their anticipation of stronger U.S. economic data coming in. However, in my view, it does cut a double-edged sword in the sense that, yeah, it's good for certain pockets of equity markets. However, when we start looking at those high flyer techs that are very sensitive to higher yields, if we see that risk-on situation morph into higher real yields, could be quite negative for tech stocks over the short term. This is the worrying concern right now. Inflation is at the vanguard of all markets concerns right now, and this is a real wall of worry that's building for investors over the medium term.
And Stephen, do you think March will be a better month for these numbers versus February?
March is an exceptionally great month, and we're just starting to see the light of that come to fruition now. And I'm not only talking about the U.S. markets. Let's look at the green shoots that are emerging over in Europe. We had the German IFO index that came out absolutely substantial. I think one of the worrying aspects that we may have is over in Asia, perhaps, is that we've seen a subtle downtrend in the Chinese PMI data over the past couple of months. If that moves into negative territory this month, it could be an eye-opener. Sort of a divergent view we're having right now, where the developing markets, even although they're still in lockdown, are still spending a lot of money and doing quite well thanks to those stimulus checks. But over in Asia, we could be slowing down a little bit, and that's a bit of a concern also.
And tell us about the Ever Given, the ship that's still stuck in Suez. How will that affect oil prices this week?
Well, it's not a complicated issue at all, and and it's just the longer that this delays barrels coming back to the real market, it means less oil in the refineries to process, and it means more oil on the water, and that just means higher prices. I think ultimately it's going to continue to support and rebalance the markets to some degree. At least we've got OPEC coming up this week, and looking at where prices were relative to the last OPEC meeting, which they're below, there's no indication here that OPEC's going to do anything other than roll over their quota, supply quota into May. This should be quite positive for markets. I think what we're seeing right now is in the oil markets is not necessarily anything hugely negative. I just think it's a realization that a lot of forward-looking pricing was a little too optimistic given the demand realities, and we've had a pullback on risk.
So do you think the OPEC meeting is more important versus the situation in the Suez?
Well, I think it's a look through on both eventually. I think what will happen is we're found a sort of a happy medium here. OPEC is going to continue emphasizing the fact that they're going to restrict supply. This should encourage more drawdowns for global inventories. This is quite positive. We've got an exceptionally positive narrative unfolding within 4, maybe 5 weeks, where lockdowns are going to get removed away and people are going to be, coming back out again in Europe. The U.S. is already lifting off, even although they're still having some concerns about the resurgence of COVID. I don't think any state's prepared to go back into lockdowns. I think people are just going to have to get used to this fact that COVID's still around, and they're just going to have to social distance. That doesn't mean they'll stop driving. That means they'll probably drive more rather than take public transportation. So this is a positive. Any way you look at it here, I think oil prices go up a little bit more, but I don't think we're in that super cycle mode that the market or some elements in the market have been pining for.
I know you've mentioned that March will be a better month as opposed to February, but let's look at what's happening in Europe. And I think with more closures expected in Europe, do you think numbers for oil will not be very good in terms of the demand?
This is where the big misunderstanding is happening, and I firmly believe that the factory data coming out of Europe is amazing. It's very, very strong. It points to a very solid rebound. We're looking at retail data. The backyard data is actually quite good. In other words, consumers are still spending. The problem that we're seeing is perhaps in the UK, and that's probably a result of Brexit. If you look at, if you go through any shopping, online shopping portals in Britain, everything says out of stock. What does that mean? Well, that's a problem because of Brexit, because they're not bringing stuff in from Europe, and that's a big problem. So I think we're getting back to that reality check, that lingering effect of Brexit that has sort of been pushed out of the sidelines because because of the COVID situation. But I think we're in for a reality check in some elements of the market, particularly in the UK. But I think the surprising data beats coming out of the EU are actually quite good relative to what the market's expectations were.
And let's circle back to the oil prices. Ringgit is closely related to oil prices, and will this situation in the Suez and also the OPEC meeting perhaps push ringgit up this week, or what do you think?
It's of a marginal benefit. You know, Malaysia is sensitive to oil prices. Yes, to what degree are they more sensitive to oil and less sensitive to U.S. yields? The overriding factor is U.S. yields. The bond market's a lot bigger factor for Malaysia than what oil is, in the sense that you know, a lot of bonds get funded into Malaysia, and that's an important thing. When U.S. yields go up, it makes Malaysia bonds less attractive. And we're also starting to see a policy divergence here between the U.S. Federal Reserve Board and the BNM. The market's repricing in a sooner liftoff than expected from the Federal Reserve Board, where they're not for the BNM. And this is creating a weakening tangent for the ringgit. Yeah, higher oil prices will help, but I don't think it's going to alleviate the concerns that we're having over higher yields right now.
And tell us about Bursa Malaysia and how will the local market be affected this week? PMI and trade numbers are expected this week, especially the trade numbers expected today. How do you think that will drive Bursa Malaysia?
Yeah, things were really good, looking good on the reopening narrative. Almost things were priced to perfection. Had the vaccines rolling out, it looked like travel was going to come back. But this recent surge in the West has probably delayed a lot of travel liftoff. And on the other hand, a lot of the export channels that were expected to feed more aggressively into the developed world might be taking a little bit of setback. Look, I still think the pockets of Malaysian Bursa are very, very much undervalued, and investors are going to go on that shopping bonanza at some point. I just don't know if it's this week or not, but you know, the Bursa looks to do well moving through 2021. Maybe not this week, but I think it continues to lift off for the remainder of the year.
Thank you very much, Stephen Ines, Ketua Strategi Pasaran Global XC yang bersama kita menerusi Skype dari Bangkok. Sebentar tadi kita ada mendapat sedikit masalah teknikal berkenaan dengan visual Stephen. Thank you very much, Stephen, for joining us. Dan kita akan berehat seketika kembali selepas ini.